By the 17th century many European absolute monarchies started to rise, but no country became as powerful as the France of Louis XIV. He managed to create an absolutist and centralized regime, up to the point that his reign is considered to be the prototype of the absolute monarchy in Europe. One of the most influential absolute rulers in history, Louis reformed the French government, the army, and the foreign policies, making himself the head of the state. He increased the influence of France in Europe by raising an enormous empire and acquiring multiple military victories. In spite of the alliance's opponents of several European powers, Louis continued harvesting victories and increasing the territory, the power and the French influence. Louis XIV became the most powerful and absolute monarch of Europe by organizing the largest military force of his time, centralizing all the power of France in himself, and by making changes in government policies to strengthen the power of the monarch. The absolutism is a political system that concentrates the total power in a single individual or in a small group of rulers, called the heads of the state. This political system began with the emergence of European nation-states in the late 1600s. The monarchs in Europe believed in the divine right of kings, which is the belief that the sovereigns are representatives of God, and their right to govern comes directly from the divine. Also, European nations tried to maintain the balance of power, peace and order between nations. Henry IV of France founded the Bourbon dynasty in 1589, when he signed the Edict of Nantes, promising security to the Huguenots, or French Protestants. When he was assassinated in 1610, Louis XIII becomes King of France. Louis XIII named Prime Minister to the Cardinal Richelieu, who dominates French politics. In May 19, 1635, France declares war on Spain and they fight the 30 Years' War. 3 years later, the future Louis XIV was born and becomes king at the age of 4. Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's substitute, serves as prime minister from 1642 to 1661, when the 23-year-old Louis XIV starts his personal reign. Louis XIV of France was born the September 5 in 1638. His regime has been the longest in European history, and during this time he brought absolutism to its height, established the luxurious court of Versailles, and participated in 4 wars against European countries. His father was Louis XIII and his mother Anne of Austria. The early part of his regime, while Louis was young, Cardinal Mazarin served as prime minister. The French Civil War brought Louis poverty, fear, and humiliation, and was one of the reasons he was so conscious about discipline and order. Louis married Marie Therese of Spain in 1660. Louis XIV's regime is defined by power and style. He adopted the sun as his emblem, with his magnificent presence. He promoted art, architecture, music, science and literature. Louis was a man of routine, and at the court everyone had to obey his habits of peace. The court of Versailles, just like the king, meant the wealth, the power and the glory of France. Louis used the palace to maintain the nobility close and under control, and using the daily court rituals he created around him some kind of adoration from the nobles. It was an honor to participate in the routine of the king, and the nobles competed for his favor. Louis' court was a model of royal authority, which established its foundation around the divine royal birthright. Louis wouldn't tolerate even the slightest threat to his authority. To make sure he centralized all the decisions, he created councils, to treat government affairs and the decision-making process and monitor the execution of these. He solidified his bureaucracy to ensure he was the only one that ruled. There was more authority concentrated at court, under direct supervision of the king. The roles of the king, the ministers, and the secretaries became more important for those immediately around him. Louis XIV kept a small number to ensure secrecy, and the ministers were forbidden to meet without the king. The top of the power structure was formed for a few individuals with Louis in the center. He exercised complete authority and responsibility for the formation of foreign policy and drafting strategy. Louis created 5 major administrative offices: Foreign Affairs, War, Navy, General of Finances, and Royal Household. The advisors and administrative head derived not from birth and or wealth, but from the fact that Louis XIV had called them to serve. The king kept powerful nobles out of the posts and the councils. It was not in my interest to seek for men of more eminent birth, because having need above all to establish my reputation, it was important that the public know by the rank of those who might choose to serve me, that I had no intention of sharing my authority with them, were Louis XIV's words about his middle-class advisors. We agree that were 2 key people in the development of his regime, Michel Letellier and Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Letellier was the Secretary of State for War and Colbert became Controller General of Finances in 1665. Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661 and Louis became king, and at the beginning he governed with ministers inherited from Mazarin. Colbert rose in service of the cardinal and soon gained Louis' confidence as judicial and financial official. The king made him a royal minister, minister d'État, member of the High Council. The High Council was a cabinet that the monarch adopted, to administer and enforce his policies. Colbert was also member of the Council of Dispatches and in the new Royal Council of Finances. Louis XIV delegated to Colbert the power to appoint the first president of the Parliament of Paris, Guillaume de Lamoignon, in 1658, and Colbert incorporated him to the client-age system in service of the king. Colbert and Letellier competed with each other for the favor of the king, for more influence in politics, for patronage and for power. Michel Letellier was the heart and soul of Mazarin's legacy, and we say that Michel Letellier had the imperative principle of virtuous and uncorrupt royal governance. He was Secretary of State of War from 1643 to 1662, before he became Chancellor of France, and left the place for his son. The Letellier family occupied the office of Secretary of War from 1643 to 1701. The Ministry of War helped the military officers to run the king's land-based armed forces. During Louis XIV's regime became far more effective to implement royal policy, at home and abroad. The power of Letellier was based in the office ranks of the army and at court as an explanatory tool for the success of the reign. Since the privately run of military treasury system was answerable to the Secretary of War rather than to the Controller General of Finances, the effective administration in the War Ministry depended upon the sustenance of the incorruptible, and loyal to the crown, Letellier family. France was stuck between a medieval and a modern system, and it remained essentially feudal under Louis XIV's regime. He maintained his authority not by challenging traditional elites and institutions but by accommodating them. Louis strengthened and rationalized royal authority in the central government and the military, and he brooked no interference between matters of foreign policy and war. He set and managed policy on daily basis within limits set by social, political, and financial necessity. Achieved his goals by both overwhelming and conciliating competitors for central authority. Under Louis XIV, Parliament remained relatively quiet. He designed government to ensure his authority. When Louis referred to his military achievements, he said, "I have given an empire without limit." The sentence is from the Virgil's Aeneid, and was applied to the kings of France. The army of Louis XIV was the largest organized military force in Europe with approximately 400,000 men on paper. It was molded by a complex interaction of political, social, economic, and cultural forces. Louis used the army to advance his legitimate and illegitimate progeny, to build support to the Bourbon dynasty and to disrupt the traditional patterns of patronage and clientage, which had contributed to France's instability. John Lind writes, "To understand the wars, then, you must first begin by understanding the king." Louis was a proud monarch, who stood himself as the sun of the solar system, and who grew in a time of war and in a Europe overshadowed by Spain's power. During his regime, France faced lots of enemies, but the most important wars were the War of Devolution, 1667–68, against the Spanish Netherlands, the Dutch War, 1678–79, against the United Provinces of the Netherlands, and the War of Spanish Succession, 1701–14, in which he defended the right of his grandson Philip V to inherit the Spanish crown. Louis, as other monarchs of his time, attempted to present himself as equal to an emperor, and his kingdom as an empire. Just looking at his emblem, the sun, we see traditional use of the imperial symbol implicates that he is the one divine and supreme ruler. We can say that the king knew violence all too well, so it's no surprise that Louis asserted French preeminence by force of arms. The rest of Europe feared Louis' desire for expansion. When the Spanish throne was left without a king, Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, was one of the options for the succession. Europe allied against France. This conflict led to the War of Spanish Succession, which lasted 13 years and ended with the Peace of Utrecht, with France keeping most of its early conquests and the Spanish territories divided between Austria and Spain. At the end, Philip inherits Spain, but with the promise that there won't be an alliance between Louis and him. The balance of power in Europe is disrupted and France is left with the crisis. Louis XIV died on September 1, 1715, after the successive deaths of all his direct descendants. Only two survived him, Philip of Spain and Louis XV of France. We can state that Louis was an innovative monarch. He introduced an advanced form of governing, and took the term absolute monarchy to another level. Louis consolidated France centered around him and on the ones that he thought that truly deserved it. He constructed an empire and coordinated an extensive army to defend it. Europe feared him, his talent to govern, and his effectiveness. Louis XIV of France is considered one of the most influential monarchs in Europe for his governing, controlling, and organizational skills.